Gary Ramirez. In September of 1982, on a quiet stretch of El Camino Real in Sunnyvale, California, a 15-year-old high school sophomore stood at a bus stop just after midnight, waiting for the ride home. Her boyfriend had just walked her there. He had run home to make curfew. She was alone for less than an hour. By morning, a delivery truck driver had pulled over and found her body about 100 yards away, behind a 4-foot blood-stained cinder block wall. The case sat for 40 years. The break, when it came, would not come from a confession or a tip. It would come from a tiny tube of saliva collected from one of the killer's adult children, in a routine sample obtained by a single Sunnyvale detective who had grown up in the same town as the victim. Karen Stitt was a sophomore at Palo Alto High School. On the night of September 2nd, 1982, she took a Sunnyvale bus to visit her boyfriend at his workplace. He walked her to a bus stop on El Camino Real, near Wolf Road around midnight. She had been bound with her own clothing, attacked, and stabbed many times. Both blood and the killer's bodily fluid were left at the scene. But in 1982, the Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety detectives had no way to use them. The boyfriend was an early suspect. He was eventually cleared by DNA. The case sat in storage for the next 2 decades. A DNA profile was developed in the year 2000 and uploaded to CODIS. There were no hits. The case sat again until 2018, when SDPS Detective Matt Hutchison and the Santa Clara County District Attorney's Cold Case Unit reopened it and turned to forensic investigative genetic genealogy. By 2021, work associated with a forensic genealogist had narrowed the suspect pool to one of 4 brothers from Fresno. On April 8, 2022, Hutchison covertly recovered a DNA sample tied to one of Gary Jean Ramirez's adult children, which strongly indicated the child's father was the source of the crime scene DNA. The Santa Clara County DA's crime lab confirmed the match that summer. How does a man live a quiet retirement on the island of Maui for years, knowing what he had done in California, and never once flinch? Gary Jean Ramirez, born in 1947, had no prior criminal record and had never been entered into CODIS. He was a U.S. Air Force veteran. He had moved through Northern and Southern California and Colorado before settling in Makawao, Maui. He was a father and a grandfather, a retired bug exterminator, living a quiet retirement when Sunnyvale detectives and FBI agents arrested him at his Hawaii home on August 2nd, 2022. His brother told reporters he could not believe it. He said he had never once seen Gary get angry. He said his brother would not hurt a fly. Could a man with no record, no prior arrests, no warning signs at all, really vanish into a normal life for 40 years? After more than 2 years of pre-trial proceedings, on February 24, 2025, Ramirez, then 78, pleaded no contest to first-degree murder before Santa Clara County Superior Court Judge Hanley Chu, with the kidnapping and rape enhancements dropped. On May 12, 2025, he was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, the maximum available under 1982 California law. He will be eligible for parole at age 103. Prosecutors and Detective Hutchison have publicly speculated Ramirez may have other unidentified victims. ABC's 2020 aired a January 9th, 2026 episode titled Badass Detective, profiling Hutchison's work. At the sentencing, Karen's boyfriend, David Woods, the young man who had walked her to the bus stop and run home to make curfew, addressed the courtroom. He had been considered a suspect for years before DNA cleared him. Detective Hutchison, when he had finally opened the email that confirmed the match, had said he wanted to scream but could not. He had taken a moment, opened his laptop, and clicked on Karen's photo. He had told her simply, "We did it." Ramirez is now in CDCR custody. Karen's parents did not live to see the arrest, but the next case would unfold 2 years later in a small mountain town in Northern California, where two 18-year-olds sat in a parked car talking, and a stranger in a passing vehicle decided he wanted them. Roger Neil Schmidt Sr. Just before midnight on December 14, 1984, in Bernie, a small mountain town in eastern Shasta County, California, two 18-year-olds were sitting in a parked car on Mountain View Road talking. The young man was a former Bernie High football star and a Shasta College student. The young woman was a friend who had taken a bus into town to visit her family. A man in a vehicle drove past several times before approaching on foot. He shot the young man through the window as the young man tried to shield his companion. He then forced the young woman from the car and assaulted her before fleeing. The case would sit for 40 years. It would, in the meantime, become one of Shasta County's most painful failures, sending one innocent man to jail for 2 years before DNA finally cleared him. Terrence Arndt, 18, was a Shasta College student and a former Bernie High football and track athlete. He was sitting in his parked car on Mountain View Road with an 18-year-old female friend, Roger Neil Schmidt Sr., then 23 and a Bernie resident, drove past the parked car several times before approaching on foot. He shot Arndt multiple times through the window as Arndt shielded his companion. Schmidt then forced the woman from the car and assaulted her before fleeing. She drove the mortally wounded Arndt toward help, but he died at a hospital. He was 18 years old. How long can the wrong man sit in jail for a crime he did not commit, while the right man builds a quiet life 2 states away? In 1995, Shasta County deputies arrested Thomas Elmer Brewster, a 42-year-old local felon, after the surviving victim picked him from a lineup. Brewster spent 2 years in jail awaiting trial. He was 8 weeks into a 1997 capital trial when his attorneys located a stained blouse that had been in sheriff's custody since 1984, but had never been tested. DNA cleared him entirely. He later won a $360,000 federal settlement. Across 4 decades, 34 different investigators worked the file. Bernie is a small town. Everyone there had known the Arndt family. The wrongful arrest of Brewster and his eventual exoneration only deepened the wound. In 2024 and 2025, the sheriff's office submitted preserved evidence to Othram, the private forensic laboratory in the Woodlands, Texas, with funding from the nonprofits Project 525 and Road to Justice. Othram performed forensic-grade genome sequencing on the degraded sample and built a comprehensive profile, with its in-house genetic genealogy team developing leads pointing to Schmidt, then 64 and living in Tucson, Arizona. He bore a strong resemblance to the original 1984 composite sketch. On July 16, 2025, Shasta detectives traveled to Tucson, obtained a warrant for Schmidt's DNA, and confirmed the match through Tucson Police Department's lab the next night. Schmidt was arrested on July 19, 2025, at a South Tucson apartment complex. He confessed during interrogation. His defense counsel said he had no other known criminal history. Could a man drive past a parked car 3 times, shoot one teenager, attack the other, and then disappear into a normal life in Arizona for 40 years without anyone suspecting? he waived extradition, and on December 1st, 2025, Schmidt pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and sexual assault in Shasta County Superior Court in exchange for life in prison without the possibility of parole and a full waiver of appeals, avoiding a death penalty trial. On December 16th, 2025, 41 years and 2 days after the crime, he was formally sentenced. Senior Deputy D.A. Kelly Coffell prosecuted. Sergeant Robert Richardson was the lead investigator. Sheriff Michael Johnson described the resolution as bittersweet, saying he hoped the arrest would bring some closure to the female victim and to Arndt's family. Schmidt is now in California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation custody. Arndt's parents were in court for the plea. They had waited 4 decades to hear the man who had killed their son admitted out loud. The female victim, the young woman who had managed to drive Terry to help that night while bleeding herself, has never been publicly identified. She has lived for 40 years with what happened on Mountain View Road. But the next case would unfold across the country, on a New Year's Eve in the Florida Panhandle, where a single mother left her cousin's house to celebrate the holiday and was found by a stranger walking a sick dog before sunrise on January 1st. Daniel Wells. In the early hours of January 1st, 1985, in Pensacola, Florida, a mother and her daughter were taking a sick dog to an emergency veterinarian. They had not yet welcomed in the new year in any normal sense. They were tired. The roads were empty. They turned down an empty lot at Peacock Drive and Creighton Road, and they saw a body. It was a young woman. She had been killed within the previous few hours. She had a son at home. He was 18 months old. The case would sit for 35 years before a single discarded cigarette tossed from a passing car window would close it. Tanya Etheridge McKinley was 23, a single mother who had recently moved in with her cousin in Pensacola, Florida, after a separation from her son's father. She had gone out to celebrate New Year's Eve on December 31st, 1984. She was last seen alive around 1:30 in the morning on January 1st, 1985, at a bar near the University Mall, when her cousin briefly left to retrieve children from a late-night daycare. Roughly 4 hours later, a mother and daughter taking their sick dog to an emergency veterinarian discovered her body in an empty lot at Peacock Drive and Creighton Road. She had been attacked and strangled, leaving behind an 18-month-old son. How does a baby grow up not knowing his mother, while the man who took her drives past her old neighborhood every day? Pensacola police described the case as one that spanned 3 generations of detectives. Despite physical evidence and dozens of interviews, no suspect was publicly identified, and CODIS produced no match for 35 years. Investigators said in a public statement that every couple of years, a new lead would pop up, and they would drop everything to run it down. They did this time and time again. In the meantime, a baby boy grew up without a mother. Parents buried their daughter without knowing justice, and a killer was walking around free. In 2019, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, and Parabon Nano Labs turned to investigative genetic genealogy. The crime scene profile was uploaded to an open-source genealogy database. Distant cousin matches surfaced. Genealogists built a family tree leading to Daniel Leonard Wells, a longtime Pensacola resident. On March 4, 2020, surveillance officers followed Wells and recovered a cigarette butt he tossed from his car window. Lab testing matched the cigarette DNA to the killer's fluid recovered from McKinley's body. Wells was 22 at the time of the killing and 57 when arrested. He had married, raised children, and lived in Pensacola continuously for 35 years, never once moving away from the city where the killing had occurred. He had no homicide history, but had been arrested in 1987 on battery and witness tampering charges. The tampering count later dropped after he pleaded no contest to battery, and again in 1988 on a solicitation charge. He was arrested on March 18, 2020, by Pensacola police, charged with first-degree murder and first-degree sexual battery, and held without bond at the Escambia County Jail. McKinley's sister, Renee McCall, a nurse, told reporters she had never thought she would see this happen in her lifetime, not after 35 years. What does a man do, alone in a cell, when a 35-year-old's secret has finally caught up to him? Wells never stood trial. On the morning of April 2, 2020, about 2 weeks after his arrest and 6 days before his scheduled first court appearance, he was found hanged in his cell at the Escambia County Jail in an apparent suicide, according to the Escambia County Sheriff's Office. The death was reported by the Associated Press and Law and Crime. McKinley's son, who had been 18 months old when his mother was killed, called Wells a coward who did not even wait until the trial. Pensacola police announced afterward that Wells's DNA profile would be offered to surrounding agencies for possible matches in other unsolved sex crimes. No further hits have been publicly reported through 2026. The case was later profiled on Investigation Discovery's On the Case with Paula Zahn episode New Year's Eve Nightmare. But the next case would unfold not in a single town, but along a stretch of highway running through 3 states, where the night auditors of small motels would learn over 3 years that a stranger was hunting them in the dark. Harry Edward Greenwell. For 35 years, the worst night shift hotel predator in the American Midwest was a sketch and a fingerprint. He attacked 4 motel clerks along Indiana's I-65 corridor between 1987 and 1990. He shot 2 of them dead in single nights. He sexually assaulted them. He stole small amounts of cash from the registers. The only one who survived gave investigators a description that would haunt the case for 3 decades. A white male, 6 feet to 6 feet 2, green eyes, a distinctive lazy right eye, grayish-brown hair. He became known as the I-65 killer, or the Days Inn killer. The case would only break when the FBI's own genealogy team finally reverse-engineered a family tree from a single SNP profile in 2022, 9 years after he had already died. Vicki Heath, 41, a mother of 2, was the night clerk at a Super 8 motel in Elizabethtown, Kentucky, on February 21, 1987, when she was attacked and shot twice in the head with a small caliber handgun. On March 3, 1989, Margaret Mary Peggy Gill, 24, the night auditor at the Days Inn in Merrillville, Indiana, was attacked and shot twice in the head, with about $179 taken. Roughly 4 hours later, Jean Gilbert, 34, a part-time auditor at the Days Inn in Remington, Indiana, was abducted, driven to a county road near Brookston, attacked, and shot 3 times. The same handgun was used in both March 1989 attacks. On January 2, 1990, a young clerk at the Days Inn in Columbus, Indiana, was attacked, stabbed, and robbed. She survived. How do investigators chase a shadow for 3 decades, knowing each year that he might still be out there, hunting? A 1991 Minnesota victim later gave a near-identical description. Indiana State Police ballistics tied the Gill and Gilbert killings together. DNA later linked the Heath, Gilbert, and Columbus cases. The investigation generated thousands of leads over 3 decades, with profilers initially imagining a seasonal traveler such as a long-haul trucker. In 2019, ISP asked the FBI's gang response investigative team to apply newer DNA techniques. By 2020, the investigation had grown to include the FBI's Indianapolis and Houston field offices and genetic genealogists. The crime scene profile was uploaded to public investigative genealogy databases, and the FBI's in-house investigative genealogy program reverse-engineered a family tree. A close relative match led to Harry Edward Greenwell, born December 9, 1944, in Louisville. The Indiana State Police Laboratory ran the confirmatory comparison. Sergeant Glenn Fifield announced the match was 99.9999% positive. The April 5, 2022 press conference featured ISP Superintendent Doug Carter and FBI Indianapolis SAC Herbert Stapleton. Could a man with a 30-year career in railway security have spent his nights, decades earlier, hunting the night clerks of small Indiana motels? Greenwell's biography matched his crime spree disturbingly well. He had been arrested for armed robbery in Louisville in 1963, sodomy in 1965, paroled from the Kentucky State Penitentiary in 1969, and arrested for burglary and robbery in Wisconsin in 1982, escaping custody twice before serving time at Iowa's Anamosa State Penitentiary until 1983. His first wife died in a 1978 house fire in Vernon County, Wisconsin. 6 days after the Gill and Gilbert killings, he was arrested for a traffic violation and a domestic incident in La Crosse, Wisconsin. His obituary noted he had spent 30 years in security work, retiring in February 2010. Greenwell died of cancer on January 31, 2013, at age 68, at a hospital in Lansing, Iowa, while living in nearby New Albin. He was cremated and never faced charges. His own family had no idea. The man who had hunted motel night clerks across the I-65 corridor had spent his last 20 years working in railway security, retiring quietly and dying in a hospital bed 9 years before the world would learn his name. The 3 killings are listed as cleared by exceptional means. The surviving victim from Columbus, Indiana, had given investigators the description that defined the case. She had lived for 3 decades, not knowing whether the man who had hurt her was still out there. She would only learn in 2022 that he had been dead for 9 years. But the next case would take us back even further, into the Boston of the early 1960s, where for almost 2 years, a city held its breath as women were killed in their own apartments. And one man's name became inseparable from a fear that had no equal. Albert DeSalvo. Between June 14, 1962 and January 4, 1964, 11 women between the ages of 19 and 85 were killed in the greater Boston area by an attacker who became known as the Boston Strangler. Victims were typically attacked and strangled in their apartments with articles of their own clothing tied in a decorative bow. There were no signs of forced entry. The city was paralyzed. Locks sold out. Women would not let strangers into their buildings. One man, eventually, gave a 50-hour confession from inside a state hospital. He was never charged with any of the killings. He died in prison 9 years later, stabbed by another inmate. It would take half a century and a discarded water bottle from a construction work site before DNA confirmed his guilt in a single one of the 11 cases. The official roster, compiled by the Boston Globe, runs from Anna Sleezers, 55, killed June 14, 1962, through Mary Sullivan, 19. Killed January 4th, 1964, in a Beacon Hill apartment. Other victims included Nina Nichols, Helen Blake, Ida Erga, Jane Sullivan, Sophie Clark, Patricia Bissett, Mary Brown, Beverly Simmons, Evelyn Corbin, and Joanne Graff. Massachusetts Attorney General Edward Brooke established a Strangler Bureau task force in 1964 to coordinate the multi-jurisdiction hunt. Albert Henry DeSalvo, born September 3, 1931, in Chelsea, Massachusetts, was a U.S. Army veteran, a married father of 2, and a handyman. He had already been operating as the measuring man, posing as a modeling agency scout to fondle women, and the Green Man, committing an estimated 200 burglaries and assaults across New England. He was arrested November 3, 1964, for a Green Man assault and committed to Bridgewater State Hospital, where he confessed in detail to 13 killings to fellow inmate George Nassar. Nassar's attorney, F. Lee Bailey, then took DeSalvo's case. DeSalvo gave more than 50 hours of taped confessions to Assistant Attorney General John Bottomley. He was never charged with any of the killings. On January 18, 1967, he was convicted of the Green Man crimes and sentenced to life in prison. Skeptics, including Bridgewater Medical Director Dr. Ames Roby and former FBI profiler John Douglas, argued the killings looked like the work of multiple offenders and noted factual errors in DeSalvo's confessions. As summarized in Britannica's overview, what does it mean if the most famous serial killer in American history was actually 2 or 3 or 4 different killers, working in the same city, in the same way, at the same time? On November 25, 1973, DeSalvo was found stabbed to death in the Walpole Prison Infirmary. Robert Wilson, an inmate associated with the Winter Hill Gang, was tried for the killing. The trial ended in a hung jury, and no one was ever convicted. Bailey later said DeSalvo was killed for selling drugs below the inmate syndicate price. DeSalvo had reportedly planned to recant his confession to a journalist the day after he was killed. The 2013 breakthrough came from preserved seminal fluid evidence taken from Mary Sullivan's body and a maroon blanket at her Charles Street crime scene, kept since 1964 by Boston police-led forensic scientist Robert Hayes. After advances in Y chromosome short tandem repeat DNA analysis, the Boston Police Cold Case Squad, Suffolk County District Attorney Daniel Conley, and Massachusetts Attorney General Martha Coakley revisited the evidence under National Institute of Justice cold case grants. BPD. Sergeant Brian Albert surreptitiously surveilled DeSalvo's nephew Tim DeSalvo and recovered a discarded water bottle at his Boston construction work site. The YSTR profile was a familial match, ruling out approximately 99.9% of the male population. DeSalvo's body was exhumed July 12, 2013, from Puritan Lawn Cemetery in Peabody, Massachusetts. Lab testing on a femur and 3 teeth produced a direct nuclear DNA match. On July 19, 2013, Conley, Coakley, and Boston Police Commissioner Edward Davis announced the odds another white male contributed the crime scene evidence at 1 in 220 billion. The announcement was carefully limited. The DNA tied DeSalvo to Sullivan only, not to the other 10 women on the official roster. Sullivan's nephew, the journalist Casey Sherman, has continued to argue that some of the Strangler crimes had different perpetrators. The other 10 attributed killings remain officially unsolved. In 2024, CBS Boston reported that the Boston Police Department remains actively investigating claims pointing to George Nassar as the actual strangler. The case, more than 60 years after the first killing, is not yet closed. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. But the next case would unfold in a small Florida convenience store on a quiet morning in 1996, where a man opening up alone for the day let in someone he likely knew, and the killer would walk out, leaving his own blood on the freezer door. Kenneth Stowe, Jr. On the morning of February 3rd, 1996, in northwest Orange County, Florida, the manager of a Lil Champ food store was opening up alone for the day. He was 31. He had been with the company for years. The first customer of the morning came in to find the store quiet. The cash deposit was missing. The manager was not behind the counter. He was found inside the store's restroom. The killer had injured himself badly during the attack and had left his blood on the freezer door, the lottery machine, and the entrance door's key cylinder. The case would sit for 25 years before a single discarded beer can outside a Florida gas station would close it. Terrence Leslie Paquette, 31, was the manager of a Lil Champ food store on Clarkona Ocoee Road. He had been opening the store alone that morning. The killer had injured himself during the attack, leaving blood on the freezer door handle, the lottery machine, and the entrance door's key cylinder and push bar. The store's morning cash deposit was missing. Detective Brian Savelli would later note the obvious deduction. Given the violence, much of that blood had to be the attacker's, not Paquette's. The killer had stabbed Paquette many times. How does a man bleed all over a small store, leave his fingerprints on every surface, and still walk away free for 25 years? The case was administratively closed in 1997. It was briefly reopened in 2003 when a CODIS upload returned no match. It was revisited again in 2013. It was finally taken up by the Orange County Sheriff's Office's newly formed cold case unit in 2019. In late 2019, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement contracted Othram Inc. to perform forensic-grade genome sequencing on a blood stain from the beverage freezer handle. Othram developed a comprehensive genealogical profile in 2021 and returned the data to FDLE. FDLE genetic genealogist Debbie Abney uploaded it to GED Match and Family Tree DNA to build family trees. The work narrowed the suspect pool to 3 brothers and pointed to Kenneth Robert Stowe, Jr. Stowe was 28 in 1996. He had previously worked at the same Lil Champ store. He lived in an apartment less than a mile from the crime scene, directly across the street from Paquette's apartment. By 2021, he was 54, lived in Eustis in Lake County, and worked for a building supply business. He had no significant publicized prior criminal history. Could a man kill his old co-worker and then live for the next quarter century just down the road from where it happened? After GPS surveillance was authorized in August of 2021, Detective Savelli followed Stowe on September 14, 2021, and observed him discarding a gray trash bag containing beer cans into a public dumpster outside a Citgo gas station. Saliva on the cans matched the unknown 1996 crime scene blood. Stowe was arrested November 2, 2021, at age 54, and charged with first-degree murder with a weapon and robbery with a deadly weapon. At his arrest, he admitted having worked at the store but denied the killing. The case is frequently cited as the first murder solved by Orange County's cold case unit using forensic genetic genealogy. After a 5-day trial before 9th Judicial Circuit Court Judge Robert Egan, an Orange County jury found Stowe guilty of first-degree murder with a weapon on August 25, 2023. Judge Egan sentenced him to life in prison the same day, as confirmed by NBC News and WFTV Orlando. Stoff is incarcerated within the Florida Department of Corrections system. No successful appeal has been reported through 2026. Paquette's family had waited 27 years for an answer. Detective Savelli, who had carried the case file the longest, finally got to deliver it. The man who had walked in that February morning demanded the cash deposit and left a trail of his own blood across the freezer door, the lottery machine, and the entrance push bar, had lived less than a mile from where it happened. He had then moved one county over and lived 25 quiet years before a single trash bag at a sit-go dumpster did what 25 years of investigation could not. But the next case would take us back even further, to a Texas Valentine's Day in 1974, when a high school cheerleader was abducted from the parking lot of a bowling alley after a school dance, and a single piece of trash dragged to the curb in 2020 would finally close the case 46 years later. Glenn Samuel McCurley Jr. On the night of February 17, 1974, in a parking lot outside a Fort Worth bowling alley, a 17-year-old high school cheerleader was sitting in her boyfriend's mother's Ford LTD. They had just left a Valentine's Day dance. They were talking. A man yanked open the passenger door. He pistol-whipped her boyfriend unconscious with a Ruger handgun. He dragged her into the night. The attacker dropped his gun's magazine in the parking lot during the struggle. Her body was found 3 days later in a culvert in a cow pasture. The case would sit for 46 years. The man who took her would, in 1974, sit in front of 2 detectives, agree to a polygraph, pass it, and be eliminated as a suspect for the next 4.5 decades. Carla John Walker was a Western Hills High School cheerleader in Fort Worth, Texas. She was sitting in her boyfriend's mother's Ford LTD in the parking lot of the Brunswick Ridge-Lea Bowl. A man yanked open the car door, pistol-whipped her boyfriend Rodney McCoy unconscious with a Ruger handgun, and abducted Walker. The attacker dropped his gun's magazine in the parking lot during the struggle. Walker's body was found 3 days later in a culvert in a cow pasture roughly 30 minutes south of Fort Worth. An autopsy determined she had been attacked and strangled. Because the dropped magazine fit a Ruger, detectives compiled a list of recent Ruger purchasers in the Fort Worth area. Glenn Samuel McCurley Jr., who lived only blocks from the bowling alley, was on it. When detectives visited him in March of 1974, he claimed the gun had been stolen from his truck 6 weeks earlier while he was fishing. He agreed to a polygraph. He passed it. He was eliminated. The case went cold for 46 years. How do you eliminate the right man as a suspect in a single afternoon and then watch him live a quiet life 2 miles down the road for the next 46 years? Fort Worth police reopened the case in 2019. Cold case detectives Jeff Bennett and Leah Wagner sent biological evidence taken from Walker's clothing to the Serological Research Institute in California, which developed a single-source unknown male DNA profile. CODIS produced no hit. The profile was then sent to Othram, Inc., which used forensic-grade genomic sequencing. The Oxygen Network financially sponsored the testing. Othram CEO, Dr. David Middleman, called Bennett on July 4, 2020, to report that the profile had been narrowed to the McCurley family. On July 7, 2020, officers retrieved trash from the curb of McCurley's home. The trash DNA matched. A confirmatory cheek swab was obtained September 10, 2020. Could a man pass a polygraph for a crime he had just committed, and then keep that secret for nearly half a century? McCurley, born around 1942, had a 1961 Abilene car theft conviction that had landed him in state prison for 2 years. He had married Judy Watson on February 16, 1963, just 1 day before the date that would later become the anniversary of Carla's killing. He had driven a U.S. Postal Service truck route, later worked as a concrete trucker, and attended Ridgelea West Baptist Church with his wife. By 2020, he was 77, frail, and white-haired. The U.S. Marshals North Texas Fugitive Task Force Delta team arrested McCurley at his Fort Worth home on September 21, 2020. After about an hour of denials, he broke down and admitted, in his own words, that he had done it. He admitted being drunk and looking for a victim that night. The Ruger handgun he had reported stolen in 1974 was found concealed inside his home. On the third day of trial, August 24, 2021, McCurley entered an open guilty plea to capital murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case is widely cited as the first U.S. criminal trial in which forensic genetic genealogy was admitted after a Daubert hearing and presented to a jury. McCurley died of natural causes in prison on July 14th or 15th, 2023, at age 80. But the next case would unfold along a Utah riverbank, where a young woman from the streets of Salt Lake City was found by 2 ranchers, and the man who killed her had been paroled from a previous murder just 8 months earlier. Joseph Michael Simpson. On the night of December 15, 1995, in Salt Lake City, a young woman left a North Temple motel to walk to a nearby convenience store and never returned. She was 17. She had moved from Spokane, Washington, just 6 months earlier. The next morning, 2 ranchers found her body on the east bank of the Provo River near Midway in Wasatch County, about 45 miles from Salt Lake. She had been killed with large granite rocks. The breakthrough would not come from advanced genealogy. It would come from a single CODIS match in 2013, a hit on the profile of a man who had been paroled from his previous killing just 8 months before he killed again. Crystal Lynn Beslanowicz was 17, originally from Spokane, Washington. She had moved to Salt Lake City roughly 6 months before her death. On the night of December 15, 1995, she left a North Temple motel to walk to a nearby convenience store and never returned. 2 ranchers discovered her body the next morning on the east bank of the Provo River near Midway. She had been killed with large granite rocks, several of them found bloodied near her body and collected as evidence. How do you investigate a killing where the weapon is a rock from the riverbank? No one saw anything. And the victim was a young woman the world had already forgotten? Wasatch County Sheriff's Deputy Todd Bonner, later elected sheriff in 2009, was the original lead investigator. The case went cold within 2 years. It was reopened in 2006 and assigned full-time detectives in 2008 as DNA. NA technology improved. Sorensen Forensics and the Utah State Crime Lab re-examined the rocks and biological evidence. In January of 2013, a CODIS database hit matched a known offender profile. The name was Joseph Michael Simpson. Investigators traveled to Sarasota County, Florida, where Simpson lived with his mother, conducted surveillance, and on August 25, 2013, recovered a discarded cigarette outside a smoke shop. The cigarette DNA matched the crime scene profile. MVAC Systems, a wet vacuum DNA collection technology, reportedly produced an even stronger profile from the rocks themselves. This case was solved by traditional CODIS work and discarded DNA collection rather than investigative genetic genealogy. What does it mean when the man who killed Crystal had killed someone else only 8 years earlier and had been let out of prison just 8 months before he did it again? Simpson, born around 1967, had a violent prior history. In August of 1987, Clearfield, Utah police had arrested him for the fatal stabbing of 26-year-old Paul Helminger, reportedly motivated by jealousy. He had pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, was convicted in Farmington court that year, and entered Utah State Prison in November of 1987 with a 5 years to life sentence. He was first paroled in April of 1995, just 8 months before he killed Beslanowicz. He was returned to prison in 1997 on a Nevada drug-related arrest while on a travel permit, paroled again that September, and discharged from parole in 2003. He moved to Sarasota, Florida around 1997, lived with his parents, and worked as a semi-truck and airport shuttle driver, with a Utah route running past the Homestead Resort in Heber City, near where Beslanowicz's body was found. Simpson was arrested at his Sarasota County home on September 17, 2013, by Sheriff Bonner alongside Wasatch County and Sarasota detectives. He was booked into the Sarasota County Jail and extradited to Utah. He was charged with aggravated murder, a capital first-degree felony, but prosecutors declined to seek the death penalty. His 4-week trial in 4th District Court in Heber City began September 15, 2016. After about 4 hours of deliberation on September 29, 2016, the jury convicted him of aggravated murder. The next day, the same jury sentenced Simpson, then 49, to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Utah Court of Appeals affirmed his conviction in May of 2019. Simpson is incarcerated at the Central Utah Correctional Facility in Gunnison. But the next case would close the longest cold case ever presented to a Sonoma County jury, where a 7th-grade student walked home from a friend's house one Sunday night in 1982, and a single discarded cigarette in a town 120 miles north would, 44 years later, finally bring the answer home. James Unick. On the night of May 23, 1982, in the small Northern California town of Cloverdale, a young 7th-grade student walked from her best friend's house toward a downtown video arcade. She was Cloverdale's first homicide victim in local memory. The man who took her had himself been interviewed shortly after the killing in 1982, denied involvement, and was let go. He went on to live a quiet life, eventually moving to Willows, California, about 120 miles north. 44 years later, FBI agents would follow him on the street and pick up a cigarette he had discarded. It would close the case the same week he was arrested for it. Sarah Ann Gear was a 7th-grade student at Washington School in Cloverdale in Sonoma County. She had spent the weekend of May 22, 1982, with a friend, including a trip to Santa Rosa. Around 11:30 on Sunday night, she left another friend's home on North Cloverdale Boulevard to walk home. Prosecutors say she was accosted near an alley, dragged to a secluded area beside an apartment building, attacked and killed with her own clothing used as a ligature. A firefighter walking home after his shift discovered her body the following morning. She was Cloverdale's first homicide victim in local memory. The Cloverdale Police Department's original 1982 investigation was limited by the forensic science of the era. In 2003, a criminalist with the California Department of Justice developed a DNA profile from the preserved evidence. CODIS returned no matches. The case stalled until 2019, when Cloverdale police began considering reopening it. They formally reopened the investigation in July of 2021, hired private investigator Kevin Kline, and sought FBI assistance. Federal investigators used investigative genetic genealogy, comparing the 2003 profile against familial genealogical databases. The genealogy was performed by the FBI in-house. The work narrowed the source to one of 4 brothers in a particular family, including James Oliver Unick. FBI agents conducted physical surveillance and recovered a discarded cigarette he had smoked. Lab analysis confirmed the cigarette DNA matched both the 2003 profile and DNA on multiple items of Geer's clothing recovered in 1982. Could a man, interviewed by police as a young man, walk away from a small-town homicide and live for 44 years 100 miles down the road? Unick had been a Cloverdale resident at the time of the killing. By 2024, he was 64 and lived in Willows in Glenn County, about 120 miles from Cloverdale. The case did not rely on a CODIS hit, indicating he had no qualifying prior offender DNA in law enforcement databases. At trial, Unick took the stand in his own defense, claiming Geer had propositioned him at a Cloverdale arcade and had consensual sex with him near the Russian River, before they parted ways while she was alive. Prosecutors and the jury rejected the account. Cloverdale police arrested Unick at his Willows home on July 22, 2024. What does it take in a small town to wait 44 years for an answer? His month-long trial before Sonoma County Superior Court Judge Laura Pasaglia began in late January of 2026. On Friday, February 13, 2026, which would have been Sarah Geer's 57th birthday, the jury of 6 men and 6 women returned a guilty verdict after roughly 2 hours of deliberation. They convicted Unick of 1 count of murder and found true the special circumstances of committing a lewd or lascivious act and raping a child during the killing. District Attorney Carla Rodriguez called it the coldest case ever presented to a Sonoma County jury. Sentencing was scheduled for April 23, 2026. With the special circumstance found true and the death penalty not pursued, Unick faces a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Sarah's mother, Susan, who had spent decades waiting for an answer, died in 2016 without seeing the case solved. The cigarette that closed the file, picked up off the sidewalk by an FBI agent in Willows, was a stronger piece of evidence than anything the original investigators had managed to gather, but the last case on this list would unfold across an international border in the woods of rural Washington state, where a young Canadian couple on a routine ferry trip to Seattle would disappear, and a paper coffee cup discarded from a work truck 30 years later would, in a courtroom for the first time in U.S. history, lead to a jury conviction by genetic genealogy. William Earl Talbot II. In November of 1987, a young Canadian couple from Saanich, British Columbia, took an overnight ferry into Washington state to pick up furnace parts in Seattle for a family business. They were high school sweethearts. He was 20, she was 18. They were driving the family's bronze 1977 Ford Club wagon van. They never came home. Her body was found 6 days later down a steep embankment in rural Skagit County. His was found a day after, 65 miles away, near a bridge over the Snoqualmie River. The case became the first homicide solved with forensic investigative genetic genealogy that resulted in a jury conviction. Jay Cook, 20, and his girlfriend, Tanya Van Coylenborg, 18, were Canadian high school sweethearts from Saanich, British Columbia. On November 18, 1987, They took an overnight ferry into Washington State to pick up furnace parts in Seattle for Jay's father's business. They never returned. On November 24th, Tanya's body was found down a steep embankment on Parson Creek Road in rural Skagit County. The next day, the abandoned Cook van was found in Bellingham. On November 26th, Jay's body was discovered partially covered by a blue blanket near a bridge over the Snoqualmie River south of Monroe in rural Snohomish County. Both had been killed. Despite intensive Snohomish and Skagit County investigation, FBI involvement, and rewards, the case stalled for 30 years. How do two people, on a routine errand into a country 50 miles south of their home, simply vanish? Snohomish County Sheriff's Detective Jim Scharf partnered with Parabon Nanolabs and genetic genealogist C.C. Moore. The crime scene DNA profile was uploaded to GED Match, where second cousin matches let Moore build a family tree forward to William Earl Talbot II of Woodinville in SeaTac, Washington. Detectives placed Talbot under surveillance and recovered a paper coffee cup that fell from his work truck in South Seattle. Saliva on the rim matched the 1987 crime scene profile. A confirmatory cheek swab was obtained after arrest, and his palm print was matched to the rear door of the victim's van. The Golden State Killer arrest preceded this case by weeks, but that one resolved by plea. Talbot would be the first jury conviction. Could the same technology that named the Golden State Killer also stand up to a jury? Talbot, born around 1963 and 24 at the time of the killings, was a long-haul truck driver and construction worker who lived near where Jay Cook's body was found. He had no prior felony record on file in CODIS. He was arrested May 17, 2018, at a job site in SeaTac. After a multi-week trial in Snohomish County Superior Court before Judge Linda Kreese, the jury convicted him on June 28, 2019, on 2 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. On July 24, 2019, he was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, the only available penalty after Washington abolished the death penalty. What happens when the first jury conviction in U.S. history built on genetic genealogy is, almost immediately, challenged on appeal? The appellate trajectory is the case's most misunderstood chapter. On December 6, 2021, the Washington Court of Appeals overturned the convictions, finding that Juror 40 should have been dismissed for actual bias. But on December 22, 2022, the Washington Supreme Court unanimously, 9-0, reinstated both aggravated murder convictions in an opinion by Justice Mary Yu. The court held that because Talbot's defense had not exhausted peremptory challenges and had accepted the jury, he could not appeal Juror 40's seating. The case was remanded to the Court of Appeals to address remaining issues. On remand, the Court of Appeals issued a substitute opinion in late 2023 and February of 2024, affirming Talbot's convictions on all remaining grounds and remanding only for the trial court to strike an erroneous firearm enhancement. There was no retrial. The Washington Supreme Court's reversal of the appellate decision made one unnecessary. Talbot's 2 life without parole convictions stand. He remains incarcerated at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. He has not been reported deceased as of April of 2026. The Cook and Van Kuylenborg families had spent 30 years waiting for an answer. They have spent 6 more navigating an appellate process that should have been an afterthought. The technology that found their children, a single discarded coffee cup linked back through a public genealogy database, has now been used to convict killers in dozens of states. None of the 10 men in this list saw it coming. A cigarette, a coffee cup, a beer can, a water bottle, a piece of trash dragged to the curb. That was all it took. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.